All right, that's what we want to hear. Well, welcome to the first session of the SSWG special issue webinar. I'm Kyle Clifton. I'm in the Human Dimensions Lab at Oregon State University, and I'll just be moderating our panel session today. We have three great panelists who are spotlighting the publications that they have in the special issue. And we do have 2 more sessions in October and November coming up. And so look for the advertisement for that shortly, and the registration link. A few rules of engagement for the session today. This is a recorded session for the most part. So that includes the panel presentations and then the moderated discussion portion. We'll then turn off the recording and then we'll have a more open Q&A portion. Please use the chat at any time throughout panel presentations or moderated discussion to ask questions or follow-up questions or reply. And then following the panel presentations and the moderated discussion, we will have an open Q&A. And so at that time, you can still use the chat, absolutely. And then you can also use the raise hand function in Zoom, which is probably on the bottom panel of your screen. It might be at the top, though, depending on how you have your preferences set up for Zoom. So order of operations today, we're right there at the beginning with welcome and introduction. I'll introduce the panelists to you, and then we'll roll right into their presentations. We have 3 panelists, and each presentation will be roughly 10 minutes. We'll leave some time then for a moderated discussion for some questions that were pre-submitted with the registration. We'll also have audience Q&A, so just open discussion, question and answer through the chat, or again, you can use the raise hand function and unmute yourself. And then we'll just kind of wrap up there at the end for the last few minutes. So we may not be here for the whole 2 hours today, but we wanted to make sure to leave enough time for discussion. And so with that, let me introduce the panelists for today. The first presenter is Brian Robinson. Dr. Robinson is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. His research works to understand feedbacks between social ecological systems, including how society depends on the environment, as well as how our actions affect ecological resources. In pursuit of this, he uses models, empirical field observations, and rigorous impact evaluation methods. He is passionate about using evidence to inform action and is exploring how to use emerging AI tools in evidence synthesis for this purpose. He has led interdisciplinary and international research projects in Canada, as well as Ghana, Tanzania, Senegal, Kenya, Mozambique, and India, with extensive fieldwork in multiple provinces of China. So again, Brian will be our first presenter, followed by Dr. Stasja Koot. Dr. Koot is an associate professor at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands in the Sociology of Development and Change group, and a senior research fellow at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies. He has been working with indigenous groups in Southern Africa, predominantly Namibia and South Africa, since the late 1990s, as a development field worker and as a researcher. Recently, he also started working in Indonesia. As an environmental anthropologist, his core focus is on political ecology with an emphasis on power dynamics, inequalities, and contradictions in tourism, development, and nature conservation. And our third and final speaker today will be Dr. Will D. Moreto. Dr. Moreto is an associate professor and graduate programs director in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida. He is a crime scientist, criminal justice scholar, and criminologist who engages in both applied and theoretical interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. His areas of expertise include situational crime prevention, wildlife crime, conservation rangers, and policing innovation. He is currently involved in a number of projects that examine the characteristics and dynamics of wildlife crime, including the illegal wildlife trade, as well as its intersection with other criminal activity, such as corruption. He is also involved in several projects that examine conservation-related law enforcement and crime prevention. And finally, he is actively engaged in research projects that seek to understand the experiences and perspectives of conservation rangers around the world. So a welcome and thank you right off the bat for our 3 panelists. And I think we're ready to kick things off with you, Brian, if you are ready.
Sorry, just clicking all the right buttons to get my screen up and to get my audio back on. Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and talk about this paper that is in the special issue that doesn't exactly have this title, but is very close. The title of the paper is actually New Opportunities and Challenges for Conservation Evidence Synthesis from Advances in Natural Language Processing. And I abbreviated that here to AI, machine learning, and natural language processing and evidence synthesis. This is a list of my co-authors. I want to note too that this effort was valiantly led by Charlotte Chang, who is very happily on maternity leave right now, and I am filling in for our team in presenting some of this work. Also, within that context, I should note that I'm not an AI machine learning specialist. I'm very much a user of the tools, and in this team, help think about practical application and sensible use. But Charlotte Chang is sort of our resident expert on NPL and these other methods, and so highly technical questions I'm not the best one to go for, but I can certainly talk about what we've been doing in our perspectives here. Okay, so for what I want to talk about, I just have roughly 10 minutes here, and I want to make sure we leave time for questions and interactions. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about our motivation for how we got to the place that we are in that paper that we presented. Then I'll give a little bit of the just sort of takeaways of the paper itself, AI machine learning tools in evidence synthesis, and then I'll just present some thoughts about what we're thinking about going forward and sort of what's in the paper in that regard too. So we started collaborating, this team more broadly started collaborating around an evidence synthesis question. We started with trying to understand the role of natural climate solutions in trying to generate what is broadly in the community called co-benefits. And so there's this assumption that we do take these land-based actions to safeguard, mitigate climate change, sequester carbon, prevent other greenhouse gases from being emitted, and those should come with some co-benefits, but they don't always come with co-benefits. Sometimes they come with trade-offs too. So our question was, what do we know about these natural climate solution actions that we have available, of which the literature talks about at least 22, if not more, of these, what are natural climate solution actions, different ways of protecting, managing, restoring lands to mitigate climate change. So what do we know about these natural climate solution actions and how they interact with social systems or other environmental co-benefits too, namely other ecosystem services or impacts on biodiversity? But we're particularly interested in some of the human well-being impacts, which would relate to things like community and sense of place, economic livelihoods, job security, material well-being. And so we broke these down, these human well-being and other co-impact dimensions, into 11 different categories. So if we have 22 actions and 11 different sort of categories of outcomes that we care about, it becomes a huge undertaking that spans multiple disciplines, multiple literatures, and something that would be nearly impossible to cover, even with a large multidisciplinary team. So thinking about how to bring all this evidence together to inform this natural climate solution space, which has a lot of policy momentum and funding momentum, support behind it, we turned to some of these new methods around machine learning and natural language processing to help us get our hands around this large literature. And so just briefly, that process, this is us just engaging with like, what can we do to get there, right? So our first 3 steps were sort of machine aided in some ways. That was the search and data collection. So it's just using web scraping to pull papers, not web scraping, pulling papers from Scopus and Web of Science databases, and using the search engine queries that were manually coded to do that. That from filtering articles to try to understand which ones might be relevant versus not quite as relevant for the evidence, for the question that we were trying to generate evidence for. Then we use topic modeling to try to cluster those papers that still, going from 2.28 million papers, even down to 1.28 million papers after we filtered a bunch out. We still needed ways to sift through, okay, which topics are ones that we really care about. For instance, we had lots of topics that talked about veterinary health and, animal gut science, which weren't necessarily exactly always related to things that were about, how do we feed animals things that don't create as much methane, right? Those were topics we cared about, but sort of like antibiotic, treatments for cow herds were not in the scope of what we were considering, right? And so we used topic modeling to cluster these things into different topics and filter out topics. And that part was then something that we as humans could sort of get our hands around. And as a project team, we could review topics in a manual way. And so this is where this expert review came in, is we reviewed these 800 topics, whittled it down to 364 topics that were relevant for our search. And then that comprised the final 257,000 papers, still like hundreds of thousands of papers that were in the corpus of what we thought were relevant. And then from that, we used other machine learning and language processing methods to extract information from the papers that would help us understand what's out there and what evidence we had, where it was, what topics were being covered. Right. So this is really just we went in here with an empirical evidence synthesis question, and we realized we needed these tools to try to make sense of the literature in a way that was tractable and time efficient. And so this is one of the outcomes of that initial exploration of this evidence synthesis combined with AI machine learning was this sort of heat map of all the different natural climate solutions. We have 22 of them here on the y-axis, and then all the 11 different co-impacts, human well-being and environmental co-impacts, on the x-axis here. And this is the heat map that also has the little squiggly lines within each box that shows changes, relative changes over time compared to the corpus of information in our data set. And so there's a lot there, and this talk is not about this paper, but and that was just came out in Nature Sustainability early this year. So that's out there if you want to look at it. But really, this helped inform what we put together for this Comms Bio piece around how do we then think about where we're at in terms of using these tools to help synthesize evidence for action, right? And so first, I just want to back up. These words get thrown around a lot, and certainly the folks who have been playing in the machine learning and natural language processing world for decades have been using these terms in very specific ways, and maybe not the ways that the general public uses these, or even the general academic public uses these words more recently. But artificial intelligence is really the broad catch-all category, which includes machine learning and natural language processing. And really, we want to think about these things as like, artificial intelligence can be anything that makes machines a little bit smarter, and they can make a decision, maybe just one decision that a human might make. But then machine learning says, well, we're going to make machines intelligent by using data to do that. And then natural language processing is really a close subset of that focuses on using language and text data to make machines more intelligent. And so even within natural language processing, there are a number of different types of methods that we can use. And this is partly what we cover in this paper, is that we've sort of gone from methods and models that focus on these sort of n-gram type assessments, which really just look for clusters of words, right? So n-grams, and you can go to, Google has an n-gram web browser application now where you can search its corpus of text that it has and see like when certain clusters of words have appeared over time, more or less than others. But an n-gram is just a cluster of words. So a 1 gram is just one word. So you search for a single word in the text. A 2 gram is, 2 different words that are together, and you can search for those 2 different things. 3 words then look for phrases, elephants poop in, or in the woods. Those are 3 different words, but they're clustered together. So early work was just trying to parse out how to read text in different word forms and find clusters of those words where they might land. And that's useful if you have a very specific topic that is consistently talked about the same way all the time, and you want to look for patterns of those in the literature or literature over time. Another topic or another method that came about slightly later that has been used more frequently now is topic modeling, and this is essentially clustering, but cluster analysis based on text data. And this can involve more sentiment type analysis, so it doesn't have to be specific word groupings, but you're using probabilistic models to find topics and clusters of topics that sort of group together most commonly. And so those can help you identify clusters. Usually these are untrained models that just identify clusters, and then as a human you have to go in and say, what are the clusters really focused on or talking about? And sometimes that's through the distribution of n-grams that appear in those topic clusters. You can identify what the topics are, and then you can identify how those topics may the distribution of those topics, the magnitude and frequency in which they appear, but also how they have changed over time. And then finally, the thing that's gained so much interest recently are large language models that now give a much more synthetic response to queries and questions that we might have about how to analyze and dig into specific text, right? But of course, there is, especially when we think about methods and evaluating methods and verifiability and reproducibility, there is this big trade-off among this sort of spectrum that goes, from something that is pretty transparent, you can open up the model and really see what's going on, to things that are much more complex and much more black boxy when we're working with pre-trained foundational models, these GPT models that form the basis of all these large language efforts, become much less transparent, much more complex, and potentially synthetic, but hard to develop reproducible workflows for those. Okay, and so this is one of the figures from the paper that tries to break down, where we have some of these machine learning assisted tools and machine learning integrated examples. This is really just to say, we have different stages of an evidence synthesis pipeline here across the top of the framework, and these are just examples of ways that people have used or can use some of these tools to inform or aid an evidence synthesis framework. And this goes from the filtering and screening parts of deciding relevance of a paper through things that are very common now, like Colander or even Ryan or Abstractor or R-based tools like Metagear, all the way to extracting certain variables that might be, geolocations and whatnot. This is just to say there are lots of things out there that we're currently using and are very much part of the evidence synthesis sort of norm now that are these machine learning tools. But then what I think most people are really interested in is how to use these large language models in trying to aid, speed up, develop evidence synthesis in faster ways that can synthesize across more disciplines. And these are just rapidly developing tools. So there are papers being produced on it, validation metrics being produced, but they are constantly changing. So if a paper comes out now, it's already, a year out of date in trying to assess where we're at in this space, right? And this is just a timeline that goes from 2017 to early this year when DeepSeek first came out. And we have, new iterations of all of these things just in the past, 6 or 9 months. So, of course, these things are rapidly developing, so it's hard to get a clear handle on all of this. But in our own personal use and work that we're currently engaged in, we're finding that large language models are now being used and tested in their ability to classify article relevance. This is specifically for evidence synthesis, right? They're being used to be a coder of papers. So can we extract topics from papers? Does this paper cover, sea level rise? And does this paper cover, flooding and erosion in coastal environments, right? Like, so can an LLM identify the topic that a paper is most likely about? And so for those two things, LLMs seem to be doing pretty well. Where there's more uncertainty in the evidence synthesis pipeline is interpreting sentiment or significance of findings, not just statistical significance, but, is the finding meaningful in some way? And also in interpreting valence. So if you can identify, we find it pretty good at identifying whether or not a relationship is evaluated between some variable and another. But whether or not that relationship is positive or negative, it does less well, or it's harder to get it to reproduce those kinds of, or produce those kinds of metrics reliably. And where there's still very high uncertainty is in producing evidence-based general responses, right? So stories that we hear about policymakers walking into a legislative body with a list of things that it got off of ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini that they're bringing to the floor to make policy around, that is, we would say, not an appropriate use of large language models at this time. So we're really focused on how to use this to be an aid and a tool in evidence synthesis, and not as a synthesizer of evidence itself. And concerns and future directions here, we are there's, of course, lots of questions around the environmental footprint of these computational tasks and the data centers that house them. A lot of that is sort of behind closed doors, but behind private companies that are generating these models and housing all this infrastructure. But there is a little bit of transparency that's coming out around that. So that's sort of a future area of concern. We need to figure out guidelines for reporting uncertainty and how to validate measures when we're using LLMs in evidence synthesis. I think there are big concerns about how some of these foundation models sift through the information that it has and come to some sort of average conclusion around whether or not how representative that is of certain populations, certain disadvantaged groups, marginalized groups, but also just over space and time, like when is it, where is it gathering the most evidence from, or most of its information from, and is that representative of different locations or different points in time as well? More in a longer term sort of perspective, we're also worried about this endogenous churn. So in the next 10 years, AI is going to produce a lot of information and a lot of content that we see on websites and on chat boards even. And so there's this potential for AI to be, become trained on AI generated information in the future, which is this sort of like endogenous churn of information that may not actually be synthesizing things for us in a useful way. And particularly in the evidence synthesis field, we're also worried about this skill atrophy. How to synthesize information across hundreds of thousands of papers is not easy. Even how to synthesize information across tens of or hundreds of papers is a skill that you have to practice and learn. And if we turn to these tools to just take away that step for us and engage in that, then we're losing those skills as researchers, and especially as folks who can critically evaluate the feedback that we're getting from these kinds of models and tools. And so that's another area that I think we need to pay more attention to. Maybe a place for universities to focus, both in training how to use AI and large language models, but also developing the innate skill sets to be able to critically evaluate these at the same time. And that's all for me. And I will turn it back over to Kyle. Thanks.
That was fantastic, Brian. Thank you. I feel like I learned a lot, and it's definitely making me think about my work as an instructor at universities too, and especially to your final point. So thank you very much. I think we'll keep cruising. And Stasja, if you're ready, and I think you have slides to share also.
Yes, they should come on screen any moment now. Do you see them?
It's thinking about it. There it is. It's yep, just PDF version. Is that good?
True. It's usually a bit lighter. So yeah, very different topic, I would say. That's nice. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. And yes, I'm Stasja. I was already introduced by Kyle. Thanks for that. Yeah, I talk about intimidation, and it's more like well, it's not a research paper, not like in a classical sense, because it's mostly a collection of experiences of 17 authors in total of how they have all experienced intimidation in a particular way. So let me elaborate a little bit on how that went. We wrote this paper with 17 authors, and sometimes the experiences of intimidation are combined. So the paper is built around, let me say, vignettes, personal stories of how people encountered intimidation. We are all critical social scientists. I want to highlight that critical doesn't mean negative, but it means we investigate certain elements in conservation science that are about contradictions within conservation, inequalities. We often work with local groups living next to conservation areas, for instance, and the power relations behind that in relation to funders, etc. Now we found that because we are in the middle of this investigating of power relations and inequality, etc., you also become a part of it. That's actually what we think is probably truer for critical social scientists than for others. That doesn't mean there is no intimidation in other types of research as well. That definitely is. We also highlight that in the paper briefly, but this is a focus on that critical particular position that we have. Now, people are intimidated in all kinds of ways, and we saw that it happens throughout the research process, whether it's before fieldwork or during fieldwork, the publication process or after publication. It really depends on when something happens that triggers something with people, and it comes in many shapes. Think about legal threats, character assassination. Even one of the authors experienced physical threats. A woman who was taken apart in Africa and questioned in a very remote area by policemen. That was very scary. And she actually dropped her research after that. Job exclusion and the curtailment of academic freedom more broadly. And often, not always, but there could be an ideological, political motivation behind intimidation, largely connected to the image that certain organizations or governments want to keep about the work they are doing. It's often in relation to funding interests in that regard. We frame this type of intimidation because it's so many different types of, we call that violence, that happen to people, different types of violence. And we collected that, and this overarching term captures all of it by Shiva. It's an old term from 1988, but still very relevant in that sense. And it's called epistemological violence. It needs to be distinguished from epistemic violence. Most of us work with local groups where local knowledge is disregarded or suppressed, which is epistemic violence, very well known, but epistemological violence is much broader. It's the monopoly of knowledge more broadly, beyond also local groups. Even though we work a lot with local groups, definitely that's part of it. That's an important part of it, but it's not all. It's also the intimidation of scholars themselves or within the structures of organizations, universities in relation to funders, etc. Now, I thought about this presentation for a while because I thought, how am I going to present, let's say, 12 stories? I will not, don't worry. I'm only going to present my own because that's the story I really know, and that's what I can build on. And yeah, probably good. So I will start my own story soon. This is not a new thing. When you read some old literature, some old even magazines, a famous article by Max Japan, Challenge to Conservationists, he already mentions this, that this is happening from 2004. And later, Jim Igoe, Sean Sullivan, and Dan Brockington, they had this special issue in Current Conservation, which is a very accessible conservation journal. And that was about disobedient knowledge. If you are critical or you raise unwelcome voices for particular parties in conservation, your knowledge is disregarded as disobedient. So it's building on that old literature and these old findings. Now, in my case, it's actually it's a 3-year story, but I will try to summarize it in well, let's say 7 minutes that I've got left, more or less. I published a paper together with Paul, the late Paul Habing now, and Sean Sullivan. And Sean and I, especially, we did a lot of work on community-based natural resource management in Namibia. And we followed that debate for many years. We've been going there for many years. I used to live there. She lived there. The thing is, what we found is that the papers, that we saw 2 streams of papers by the more independent scholars like ourselves, and by professionals working in the field of CBNRM, for instance, connected to big conservation NGOs in the country or internationally who were involved in this program of CBNRM, community conservation. And you could see a difference in how successful the program was being portrayed. So our main message was not that complicated, I would say. It was very simple. It's fine that you get this, that you actually raise this, and it's not a problem to do research about your own program, but be more open about it. I think it's very important to also add positionality and a reflection on your own position. And that's what we highlighted in this paper. One of the reasons why this is important is also because some of this work percolates to the public sphere. And there was one example where the trophy hunters of Namibia used some of these papers very selectively, disregarding all other research as pseudoscience. And that's a very weird thing to do, we thought, but you can see that they really build up a certain narrative that starts to dominate. Now, we still think it's fine to do research about your own program, but you have to be open about that, about the potential conflict of interest that this creates. So in a sense, we thought actually that this paper was not that groundbreaking, but we thought it was good to say this in the Namibian context specifically because this was happening so much. But it created quite a bit of havoc. Yeah, this is what I basically just said, the top part of the slide. We received, after publication, we received 2 complaint letters. And the first complaint letter was by a very vocal group of pro-trophy hunters. not trophy hunters themselves, but groups promoting trophy hunter very strongly, academically and publicly. And the letter was full of threats. There was a request to retract the paper. And then we got another letter by unidentified people who didn't put their names at the bottom of the letter, but it all went via the journal Society Natural Resources, was that the journal's editors. And they concentrated mostly on ad hominem attacks on myself and Sean Sullivan, how bad we were as researchers, that we didn't understand how research worked. All those kinds of comments were in there. So to be completely honest with you, after receiving those two letters, a few weeks after, I don't remember the exact dates, but a few weeks after publication of our paper, I didn't sleep well for 3 nights or something. That's how it goes. It did something to me. But then I decided at a certain point, okay, let me print it, very old-fashioned. I put it on my desk and I started to go through it point by point. And then I saw it, I got a better insight into what was actually happening here. Then I started to realize there was a game being played that in my naivety, I hadn't seen up till then, because point by point, I could actually see that what they wrote was simply wrong. I can give you many examples. I'm not going to do that now because I have 10 minutes, but all the papers are online. Feel free to read our last one, and I'll get to that. So what we suggested, we discussed this among the 3 authors, and we suggested, okay, in this case, the points they make, there are so many errors and insinuations, etc. Why don't we suggest to the journal to simply ask them to have a debate in the journal? Because that's more honest, that's a scientific way of doing it, it's honestly academically, etc. And we asked them not to do ad hominem attacks on Sean and me, which is what they did, of course, in these letters. So we thought that was a good solution, and then we could respond to that. That's, well, as you all know, probably quite normal in academia more broadly. And it's fine to disagree, but let them write it. It took them about a year to decide whether or not they were going to do it. So we were just left in limbo about whether this was going to happen or not. And during that year, at a certain point, we got an email saying that Taylor and Francis, the publisher, you probably all know them, was going to take off the editors from the journal, and they were going to lead the editing process. Now, we looked up the people who were going to lead the editing process, and they were corporate people, not academics. So that should have rung a bell, but it didn't. We were a bit naive. Because what happened next is that after about a year, we got to hear from Taylor and Francis editors, so to speak, that they were going to write rejoinders to our paper. Both groups a separate rejoinder, which we thought was good. But the strange thing was when they were written, that the errors were still in there. The misinterpretations, insinuations, etc. were all in there, that were also there in the letters, including even ad hominem attacks, which I think is not a way to lead to be involved in an academic debate. So these editors were in that sense a bit, were in that sense a bit, I'm just checking. Yeah, oh yeah. I had to move you guys up because otherwise I can't see the bottom of my slides, but I can see it now. So these editors were actually moving it a bit to what we pointed out was still in there, including ad hominem attacks. That's what I was saying, yes. And publicly, we were also being accused on Twitter and X, and especially Sean, she is on Twitter, I'm not, or X. I'm not for good reasons, I would say, but so I try to stay out of that public debate too, but that's where it continued. Anyway, next. What happened next was that we wrote a rejoinder. We got 2 weeks to write a rejoinder after they took 1 year to make a decision, and I think about 8 months in total to write the rejoinders. And in the end, they ended up largely copying their letters. So we were very much like, okay, why do we only get 2 weeks? But we decided not to make it a big deal because we had thought everything through already. All their arguments, if you can call it arguments, were in these letters. So we were prepared. And we decided to go for it. We wrote it in 2 weeks. And finally, our response to the rejoinders, so our rejoinder, so to speak, the 4th paper in a row, was being put online on the 15th of December 2021. So we thought, okay, this is the end of the story. That's it. However, as you can see on the slide already, one day later, the paper was retracted. It was taken offline and without any communication to us as authors, which we thought was incredibly strange. So, of course, we wrote to Taylor and Francis asking what's happening. Why is our paper taken offline? Is anything wrong? Please explain. It took us about a week, and I sent a reminder every day because, of course, we were a bit sick and tired of the whole situation. And the answer that we got in a very short email after 1 to 1.5 weeks was, oh no, a colleague in legal recommended me to do that. And okay, so a logical question to follow up was, okay, what is the legal issue? That was and we never got an answer to that until today. We got an answer after again reminders and about 1.5 weeks. Oh no, it's a production error, which is a completely different thing than a legal issue. So it's still unclear to us why this was happening. So anyway, they wanted to put it back online, but we said, no, we want to put this in a footnote that this happened. We feel it's important to add this retraction because the word legal, the word production error, for us, this was very important in the scheme of things of the whole process. So we decided to add a footnote with purely factual information, namely exactly quoting what they had written in an email. We left the people of Taylor and Francis anonymous, but we quoted their email like, okay, it's legal, it's production error. So what is it? We don't know. But we thought it was important against the background of the story, what happened thus far. And then they said, even though it was purely factual, they decided it had to go through another round of peer review, which we thought was very weird because all we did was add a factual footnote. Any editor would have agreed on that probably. And we could clearly indicate why this was relevant. And the other ones were not retracted despite them being full of errors still about our papers. And then finally, after half a year, the reviewers responded, what's this? We could see in the reviews that they didn't understand why they got the paper again, which I understand from their point of view. And then it was put on hold for another 2 months or something. We don't know why. We didn't get an explanation. We kept emailing, and finally it was put online in, that's May 2022. And the fact that the word legal was in one of the, so this was our latest response to the 2 rejoinders that we received on our original paper. The fact that it was done illegally, that the word legal was there, sorry, actually made us realize that we had to look for some support in the process. And I contacted the legal department of my university, which was a very important step for me to do because for us as a group of authors, because we assume, and this is my assumption, but I can never tell, that in the background lawyers had been pushing from big conservation NGOs and from trophy hunting supporting organizations. That's what we assume. Until today, we don't know what the authors of the rejoinders were trying to achieve, as we say here. Probably a retraction of the original paper only. I think that's how it started, or at least change it up to such a degree that it suits their ideology better, their perspective. That's what we assume, but we can never tell. But it actually, going back to that, it actually confirmed what we wrote in that paper, the importance of positionality and reflexivity, in our opinion. So back to the paper that we wrote with 17 authors. This was only one story in that paper. And in the paper, it's less detailed. Like I said, other examples, people went through all kinds of intimidation and epistemological violence in that sense. Physical intimidation, I gave you a brief example of that already, but also psychological threats. Often it's a combination. What we went through also had some psychological effects, and it didn't break us in that sense, but it definitely gives you a bit of stress in my personal experiences, but also the threat of job loss. There are a few examples of that, of people whose contracts are not being extended by their universities because the universities are being put under pressure. You can also find examples of that in the paper. The blockage of research permits, and there's of course a big issue there that's often done by governments who think that, well, one of us literally got to hear that political ecological research, now we don't do that anymore. So that's the end. So critical research about inequality, only so-called applied research. And don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of applied research. I do that as well. But sometimes you also need that critical perspective. I think they are most valuable complementary. So these tactics of epistemological violence, they have implications for understanding and improving long-term conservation, we think. That's the point we make, because you silence a certain perspective that may be critical. Yes, indeed, it may highlight power relations and it may highlight inequalities or certain contradictions within activities. But that's a perspective that you also need to be able to make that next step. And nothing we do is perfect, of course, but yeah, if we really want to achieve social justice and conservation, we feel that's a very important. We need to acknowledge that this is important too. We end the paper with 4 suggestions, and some of them are rather broad. We are aware of that, but it's just to emphasize things that are also happening already. I also work together a lot with ecologists as well. It's not it's a different type of knowledge maybe that we sometimes produce, but the complementarity is exactly what we feel is important. So the collaborations, the first point on the slide, are very important. And I think being also self-reflexive to us as critical social scientists, we should also think sometimes more often beyond the critique itself. Don't get me wrong, like I explained, the critique itself is important, but also at least think about possible actions. And another point, we think is important, is to diversify conservation curricula. Don't worry, it's not a suggestion to completely change conservation studies or ecological studies into social sciences, but to at least include 1 or 2 courses where the social ecological context is highlighted, and at least make people think about the philosophy behind science and the epistemologies behind the things that you are doing. Partly that seems to be happening already in some universities, but yeah. So and of course the role of funders also seems to be important. Why are people afraid of having some critique out there? And we believe that the role of funders is important in that regard as well. So try to also reach out to funders. Most of the time they are not our most direct contacts. And I mean funders of conservation schemes as well. Yeah, I want to also thank my co-authors. The names are listed there, a little bit small, but thanks to all of them, and thanks to all of you for listening to me. That's it from my side for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stasja. That was a great example of how storytelling is really effective to communicate information, and very clever of you as one of your 4 suggestions to be a suggestion to make suggestions of actions. That's so thank you very much. We'll get to our 3rd panelist now, Will, and I think I'm gonna share slides for you, Will. Does that
Yeah,
sound
thank
good?
you very much. Yeah, we were
Oh,
having some technical problems there, so if you don't mind taking the lead on that.
not a problem. Let me put the link to the publication for you in the chat before I lose being able to see really well here. And feel free to holler at me if I'm advancing too quickly or not quickly enough.
Will do. Yeah, I'll let you, I'll just say the next slide if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Let me get this
Thank
playing.
you.
All right, is that looking good for you guys?
Yeah, looks good on my end.
Okay.
All right. So thank you very much to Kyle and Bright for organizing this event, to my fellow panelists, and for the audience for attending. So in 2017, Nathan Bennett and colleagues published an excellent article that showcased the value of integrating 18 social science disciplines within conservation science and practice. In our paper, we proposed the integration of 3 additional disciplines, specifically criminology, criminal justice, and crime science. As we all likely know, conservation is not immune to illegal activities and behaviors. Moreover, the potential value of understanding both formal and informal responses to such behavior can prove key in preventing and reducing future events, while also providing guidance on avoiding counterproductive or deleterious outcomes. Not everything that we think is going to work out well always does, and in some cases it leads to negative outcomes. Importantly, the integration of these disciplines fosters a greater appreciation and understanding of the human dimensions of conservation science and practice. Human beings create laws, human beings violate them, and human beings respond to them. So in our paper, we propose that criminology fits within Bennett and colleagues' framework in the broader categories of classical and interdisciplinary conservation and social science, and that criminal justice as a field can be situated within classical and applied traditions, whereas crime science fits within applied and interdisciplinary traditions proposed by Bennett and his colleagues as well. So next slide, please. So criminology as a field is essentially the scientific study of criminal and deviant motivation, behavior, and activities. So criminology can provide insight into illegal and deviant behavior that impact conservation and to improve understanding of why people do or do not comply with environmental laws and regulations, and presents opportunities to examine behavior from macro, meso, and micro levels. There's a number of different criminological theories that exist out there that have been empirically tested that provide various insight into why individuals engage in certain types of behavior. In particular, criminology is fairly well known for not only just looking at why people commit offenses, but also why people don't commit more. So in other words, what are the kind of factors that limit us from actually engaging in criminal behavior? As I mentioned, it also focuses on both macro levels, so it could be related to political ecology, it could be related to other kind of macro level forces, as well as individual level kind of components as well. Next slide, please. Now, at times, criminal justice is subsumed within the broader category of criminology. In some cases, some folks believe it's more of an applied criminology. However, other scholars have argued that criminal justice as a field should be looked at it as a separate discipline, particularly because of the fact that we're looking at different dependent variables. We're looking at different outcomes in a lot of ways. And so criminal justice, particular criminal justice theories, can be used to examine the intersections between criminal justice stakeholders, assess how laws and regulations are interpreted and implemented on the ground, and analyze and evaluate the implementation of criminal justice policies and practices. Research can also examine actors involved within the criminal justice system, so those working as law enforcement officers, corrections officers, and so on, and examine and assess their job stress, decision-making, job satisfaction, corruption, and so on. Further, research on important topics such as, again, as I mentioned, discretion, compliance, and procedural justice can also be performed. Next slide, please. Now, unlike criminology, which focuses on kind of criminal motivation and behavior, and criminal justice, which looks at the formal and societal response to criminal behavior, crime science tries to understand the crime incident itself. One of the key things is understanding where crime occurs, when it occurs, understanding hotspots, understanding how certain times are committed, and also recognizing that not all crimes are the same in terms of how they're completed, even if they are similar in terms of type. So crime science can provide guidance on how to analyze crimes that affect conservation to inform crime prevention and reduction measures, including those that do not require the involvement of the criminal justice system. Now, this is important because we know that in research, the criminal justice system not only can be effective, but also can be problematic, not only in the sense of setting people up for failure, should they be not only erroneously prosecuted, but we also know that the criminal justice system puts people behind. And so there's a lot of challenges related to just relying solely on the criminal justice system. And so crime science provides other additional measures to prevent crime from even occurring so as to not introduce individuals into the criminal justice system. Crime science can also inform and guide the analysis of crime prevention related incidences, including, again, as I mentioned, the spatial and temporal characteristics. So I'm just going to, next slide, sorry. I'm just going to put up the kind of the theory of change that we introduced in this paper. And I'm just going to briefly speak on this as I kind of allude to it. So in addition to the unique disciplinary contributions of criminology, criminal justice, and crime science, we believe that it can be used in tandem with the other social science perspectives that was introduced in Bennett's framework to address conservation challenges. So, for example, criminology can be used alongside environmental sociology, environmental psychology, and political ecology to provide a more comprehensive assessment of factors that influence criminal, deviant, and harmful behavior. Criminal justice can be used in conjunction with environmental and conservation law to improve understanding of how and when specific laws and regulations are interpreted, negotiated, and applied. And then finally, crime science can be used within human geography, conservation marketing, and science and technology studies to assist in the development, application, and communication of tailored crime and harm prevention measures. And so what we have here in terms of this, the kind of theory of change figure that we have on screen right now is kind of identifying the various not only enabling conditions that can contribute to the integration of criminology, criminal justice, and crime science, but also provides an insight in terms of the projected outcomes of such integration. Now, one of the key things that I think bodes well for incorporating these kind of perspectives is to further understand behaviors that we may not necessarily want to occur in conservation, but can and will. Additionally, understanding how societal responses can, again, impact how we view certain challenges that are related to deviant or harmful or criminal behavior, again, provides us with a better framework to approach these problems prior to the development and implementation of certain types of regulations and rules. Increasingly, there's been a focus on also expanding the viewpoint of traditional criminology and criminal justice perspectives to account for attitudes, theories, and concept and knowledge that go beyond kind of a Western-centric viewpoint. A lot of what we know and develop from criminology and criminal justice tends to stem from the global north, particularly a lot from the United States, from Europe, and so on. Increasingly, though, more insight and more knowledge in terms of the expansion of criminology and criminal justice to account for different perspectives and viewpoints allows us to tailor and get a better idea in terms of what strategies could be potentially effective and useful in different populations and in settings. And I believe that by integrating criminology, criminal justice, and crime science within the conservation sciences and practices allows us to expand not only that knowledge, but allows us to kind of reevaluate kind of where we're currently at in those specific fields. So I just wanted to kind of touch upon that, keep things nice and brief, but obviously happy to answer any questions that kind of arise. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me get out of presenter mode here so I can see y'all. And we're going to move on to some questions that were submitted previously. If you guys are, if there's no immediate questions from any of the speakers right now. Okay. So the first question is, it is on the use of AI, which is relevant most immediately to Brian's presentation today, but really I think pretty relevant to the work that we all do. And so this is on what do you guys think about the trends of publication and the use of AI? So I'll put the question in the chat. So this is, pretty general. It can be about the actual authoring of submitted manuscripts for publication. It could also maybe be a little dash of what Brian presented on of how we are combing the resources that are available of published works. And so how do y'all see that showing up in each of your particular areas of expertise or niches of the work that you do?
As I talked about it, I think I'll let somebody else answer the question first. So.
Sure.
For all of you mean for the three panelists or for everyone this question?
I think in particular for the three panelists
Ah.
right now, but if any of the
So,
participants have some thoughts, please go ahead and pop them in the chat.
well, then I can elaborate a bit on my experiences and perspective. Well, I don't have a lot of experience with it, so not many experiences I will elaborate on, but my perspective. Well, we do a lot of field work, like I said, and that's really hard to. I don't know how to use AI there. Maybe it could be useful. I know students of mine do that. And maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but students of mine, they do that and they use these tools to work out their interviews a lot quicker, which I think I don't really see a problem there, but I do think you need a human check on that. So you always have to, well, listen back if they are recorded, etc. And still double check if what is being said is indeed written down correctly, I would say. At the same time, what I feel as a qualitative researcher, the interpretation of data is very important. And that's where maybe AI may not be as functional as we all would like it to be, if I may put it carefully, especially because when you do interviews, you see, well, what's important for me is the emotion of the people that I do interviews with, or the observations around me, in classical ethnography. And why do people raise their voice? Is that something AI picks up? Well, at this stage, as far as I know, but maybe Brian, please correct me if wrong. You have much more experience with this, but as far as I know, it doesn't pick those sometimes small details that may be worthwhile to also include in your data. They are important to me. So if it's only a textual analysis, well, for research like Brian did, I think that's completely fine. But in my case, it would be very different, I would say. Yeah. So that's my quick take on this. I do have a question also for Brian, but I'll leave that for later, right? Correct, Akal? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, as with a lot of different things, AI is very much a tool. And so how you use that tool will be based in terms of what the objectives might be and all that. But I think that while AI has a lot of potential benefits and advantages, particularly in our ability to be more efficient, I agree. I think it also raises challenges in the ability to contextually inform and situate information. And so I agree that in the sense of having a human check is extremely valuable, particularly if it is qualitative in nature, particularly if it's a case study in nature as well too. I think there's a lot of benefits in ensuring that there is that human check. If it's more of a general, here's kind of a state of affair, then I can understand absolutely the benefit of it. As long as it's not necessarily stating that this insight is going to be absolutely relevant for this specific area or location or setting. I think it still needs to have some kind of a human qualifier in that component. So I do think there's an absolute value in it, but like all tools, it's on how it's used.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah. Oh, please,
Well,
Brian.
okay, I'll just jump in real quick after hearing those good thoughts from my two co-panelists here. But yeah, I think there's a big, well, it's a wild world out there now. I think there are a lot of different uses of AI in sort of the academic space, and some are judicious and well thought out and very functional and practical, and others skirt a lot of gray areas that I think we don't want to see AI taking over. For instance, the actual writing of papers and the production of literature reviews and material that is used in literature reviews. I think that comes at a significant expense to the researchers themselves that are often graduate students that are trying to gain a handle and foothold in fields, and if they don't actually understand the sort of breadth of the literature and what is being produced and how it's produced, and how to critique it, and they're using AI to generate these sort of background sections to publications. I think we're losing I think that's part of this skill atrophy that we become in danger of engaging in if we let these things go too far. But and I think AI is allowing for quicker writing and quicker development of publications than has been possible in the past, partly because of this. So I worry about those things, and I worry about how to set up sort of protocols for how to use AI in research. Like I fully agree that using AI to help develop field materials, survey questions, even developing an initial like brainstorm list of ideas for how to go about doing something. I think these are all really good uses of AI, but where you use it as a support tool for augmenting your own thinking and your own analysis, and where it becomes the thing that does the analysis and the quote thinking. I think we need better ways of reporting that and being transparent around it, but also guidelines for how to engage in what is sort of responsible in this space.
And we've got Aaliyah in the chat, who is a program and conference committee SSWG alum. So hi. So she says there's a potential interesting link of whether AI will perhaps be a form of epistemic violence long term. If AI starts training the future and we don't build the skills to know when it's right or wrong and who controls the AI, seems probably to greatly shape the future of science. So we've got kind of some crossover within the talks here, and I think I'm hearing some of the final question marks of Brian's presentation, which so maybe a little bit skill atrophy and then maybe a little bit of that endogenous churn. Any thoughts coming up for you guys on that?
Yeah, I agree with this. I think that again, I think it's the key thing is just recognizing it clearly as an opportunity and as a tool. But I think that as humans, we cannot be complacent and not continuing with how we are training, future scholars, educators, and so on. That skill set is extremely important still as a check. But also, I think that there's the challenge of over-reliance on technology that could potentially arise from this. And I think that's where we come in, right? This idea like, this might be the old school, slow way of doing things in terms of how to evaluate research and methods and so on, but it's an important skill set. It doesn't mean you can't use certain tools and techniques to be more efficient. But I think there's still a responsibility to be held accountable for, what you still put out there, and training students and future scholars and researchers and scientists, again, is on us to ensure that that continues.
I agree. And can I add a little bit to that in response also to Aaliyah's comment? That epistemic violence may be already there in AI. It might not even be only a thing of the future, I would say. This is just an assumption I have, but because of epistemic violence is the suppression of especially different types of knowledge, and on the internet where AI searches, and you see already that this is dominated by particular countries, generally Western, but definitely not only anymore. That would be too simplified. But you see that definitely local types of knowledge, different types of knowledge, are not as well presented on the internet more generally. So I like that. Well, I don't like it, but I think that connection with epistemic violence that you raise here, Aaliyah, is important to also be aware of when using AI, even though there may be mentionings of different types of knowledge on the internet. But this is generally because it's statistical algorithmic models that do it. And as far as I know, but maybe Brian, again, correct me if wrong, this is done with what's being shown most that generally comes out of these algorithms as the presentation by AI, if I always understand it correctly. So that would be I think you're raising a very important point that's already there, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's already been lots of evidence to show that AI is sort of has racial biases and certainly certain biases against more minority ways of knowing, because precisely that it is a statistical, it's built on a statistical foundation that is looking for the best guess according to all the data that it's pooled in the throughout its history, right? And so that depends on what that knowledge, what the biggest representations of knowledge are within that corpus of text, which certainly by definition just excludes the corners and margins of where that of what that knowledge could be or how it's produced. And often I think it's like, especially when we get the sort of first answers from AI, it is based on sort of that median kind of like set of information that comes from its training material. And you can sometimes ask for alternative viewpoints or minority viewpoints, or like what other things are there that but nobody goes that far, right? Nobody gives it a chance to sort of like say, well, what else is there in the bits of your knowledge that would be different from what you have just given me as sort of like the average answer. And so I think without thinking about that and without knowing it and without sort of having the perspective of being like, well, it's not giving me a synthesis of all the material, it's giving me one sort of slice of what's out there. I think that's where the danger. That's one of the dangers. I think there are many, but I think it's also immensely magical and productive and a shortcut to so many things that have been tedious in the past that there's no way it's not going to be used. And so I think the challenge is figuring out how to balance, right? How to maintain this balance between understanding how to use it as a productive tool, but also having, as Will had mentioned as well, having this sort of like this critical view of, well, what is it giving me, and how, what is it good for, but also what are the limitations and critiques.
And really similar to what you were just speaking on, Brian, in the chat, recently asked AI for certain types of scholars in a particular subject matter. The AI I asked kept ignoring those scholars and suggesting others that were not related to what I asked. It was interesting as to who seemed silenced. I had to know who it should tell me to know it was ignoring scholars. So, and I think this discussion is really getting at the next question we had primed here. So I'll put it in the chat, but it's how my AI tools unintentionally reinforce epistemic injustice, and what safeguards do you recommend? So maybe let's, for another moment or two, really think about the second end of that question of what safeguards do you recommend? I mean, training was brought up, skills-based, actually do the reading, actually learn how to, or practice synthesizing information, how to critique available information. And it seems maybe too, like there's a layer that is kind of a cousin to the why to develop these skills, but it's kind of an ethical layer on top of just the skills layer. So maybe if you guys have thoughts on that or any other recommendations for safeguards.
A quick thought that comes to my mind is related to education. I mean, not specifically research, but I do a course where students used to write an essay towards the end of the course instead of an exam. And the last 2 years, these essays were grammatically all correct. And it wasn't like that before. So something changed there. And I started to think about it, and I could see that, well, I don't recognize AI, and there are technologies to find out whether it's written by AI, but then it's becoming like a battleground, who's ahead of the other. And I heard it's not exactly right. So it's just a change also in education. Of what I want to do for next year is actually to let them do a presentation and hold a discussion about the topic, and they can still use AI in preparing it. But long essays are becoming maybe a bit too easy. if they put in the right prompt, as you say it, that you for AI. So and I don't want to deny the use of AI in research or education. Like you guys also said, it's there and it will be used. So, but I think it's for students very important to also think about what they are actually doing. And if you let AI do all the thinking, it becomes a bit too bland, I would say. So that's just an example of a potential safeguard in relation to specifically to teaching that I assume we all have to, we all are involved in as well.
I think within the context of AI specifically, I think one of the best ways to kind of get an idea of the safeguards that are needed is for people to use it, and use it often. Like, and use different types of AI, right? Expose yourself to what AI is about. What are the potential, again, the benefits and the limitations of it. I think this increased use of it within the parameter of essentially testing it out, as opposed to just relying on the information that you get from it, but an actual kind of deliberate, like, I want to test out AI, and increased use for it will potentially identify areas that are, again, the challenges and limitations of it. And as a result of that, then you can, establish safeguards that derive from it. I think the big challenge that we have when it comes to AI is, are we establishing safeguards for a problem that was yesterday? Is it yesterday's problem that we're trying to safeguard against? Because it's growing exponentially. And so I think, again, just being cognizant of that as well too is very important as well.
I need to keep that front of mind, especially. I am not inclined to use it, and I always kind of forget that it's an option, and in what context is it helpful and not helpful. So I will hold that with me as I move forward. Brian, did you have any other thoughts, or we can move on to the next submitted question?
Well, I mean, only to say that I know, at least in an educational setting, some folks are, trying to completely ban AI in classrooms and, going to doing more in-person evaluations, even like, writing, essays in class instead of having them be written at home just to, verify that it's actual, things coming out of people's brains and not their computers. And maybe there's role for some of that as well, but I also think it would be a great disservice to just cut out, any kind of training that uses AI as a way to sort of as a tool that we should be taking advantage of, right? So I think there is sort of this hybrid, especially in an educational setting. I think that's maybe one place where universities can actually provide some value, is saying, like, here, you need to learn how to do this, like, from your own brain, to be able to evaluate what AI is giving you or not giving you. And so you need to learn both of them side by side. And so universities, I think, can sort of hold back the AI a little bit, like in a classroom setting, so that when people are out in, quote, the real world doing their jobs every day and have these AI tools available, they'll be able to use them more effectively and smartly.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and pop in the chat our next question. This is in particular for Stasja, so I'd love to hear from you first, and then Brian and Will also, if you have any thoughts, or anyone else in the chat is always an option too. So this is, what does resistance to epistemological violence look like in practice? And I know you had some suggestions at the end of the talk, so maybe kind of digging into those and providing some examples. And then I think, particularly in the context we're in today, what role can institutions like the Society for Conservation Biology play in supporting it?
Yeah. I think, well, one thing that I mentioned in the presentation also that was not in the suggestions towards the end, was to use legal department if you have it, and most universities have it. And I used the word naive at a certain point because we had not gone through such a process before. And we only realized at a certain point that, hey, there's something corporate and legal happening. When you think about it, Taylor and Francis pulled out, we get a vague email saying there is a legal issue, or a colleague in legal recommended them to retract our paper. And that's when we at a certain point realized we have no legal backup at all. And probably we don't know. There are lawyers at the other side. These are big players that we are, let me say, fighting with. And yeah, so I think be aware of that if you're really being put under pressure. Now, I don't say our legal system is necessarily, whatever country you live in, is necessarily always the solution. There may be culprits there as well. But yeah, in this case, it really helped us. So definitely see it as an option, an option of resistance. Yeah, and I think talk to your institution. And one of the examples in the paper also highlights that, well, that's in Norway. One institution actually limits academic freedom under the pressure of WWF. And another academic institution also in Norway says, no, we defend our scholar here with whatever is happening. So talk to your institution, if necessary, at a higher level, or your chair, or whoever. Depends on how your institution is structured, who you need to talk to, and use academic freedom as an argument. We all believe in that, I hope. And so yeah, come up with the facts and be foolhardy. That's what we did. I mean, we had to be, in a way, stubborn and keep going, even though some of my colleagues at a certain point, of course, you talk about these things with colleagues, and at a certain point they asked, are you not sick and tired of the process? Don't you want to drop it? And my honest answer was yes. But we got in so far that we reached a point that we actually just, well, became a bit maybe stubborn. But I'm very happy with the end result, because everything that's online now, I fully support what we wrote. And even though it's probably quite nitty-gritty about they make an error, but it's not true. Sometimes it gets into that nitty-gritty stuff, but at least it's out in the open. If I ever want to defend it again, which I hope I don't have to, but then at least it's there out in the open. So stay loyal to the facts. And be honest and open about them. And yeah, collaborate also with ecologists or organizations. I had a bit of trouble with WWF. I think that was clear in the presentation, but I actually collaborate with them in a new project in another country. So, and WWF is of course a bit of a weird organization in the sense that they're very fragmented. When you compare them, for instance, with Conservation International, they have one clear ideology, and they basically implement that wherever they work. WWF is very different, and I know a few people in the Netherlands who work with them, or who work at WWF, and I get along with them very well. So also, yeah, be careful to expand your idea of, try to go back to, I understand at a certain point I was very frustrated and I didn't want to work with WWF anymore, anywhere, whatever. But these were only a few people working for an enormous global organization. And there are always in all these organizations people having a different mind that you may be able to talk to, and in Namibia, it's a very unequal country. It's always it's the second most unequal country in the world. This was mostly about Namibia. You see there's a power position of elitist groups, and WWF is definitely part of that. So that made it very much a big thing for them, I think, what we wrote in our original paper. So yes, stick to your points. I really like I think our best recommendation is to include social sciences, and not too much, but also in conservation and ecology courses in education. I think that's very important to start thinking about it when you're a young ecologist or conservationist, not because social sciences are more important than the other, but because they're complementary. And to completely disregard that psychologically is not healthy when you work in the field. Even when you work with elephants, there are people living there. There is politics behind it. There is a government involved. There are private actors. I assume we all know that. So that's so important to at least create that awareness at an early stage. And then you can still focus on the elephants later, but at least you can contextualize your own findings a bit. So I think that's the most, maybe the most important recommendation of the four. So yeah, that's what I can add to it for now. Yeah.
Thank you. And just kind of to the panel more broadly, what role do we think institutions like SCB can play in supporting this resistance, aside from lawyering up, I suppose?
Well, I don't know if I have specific recommendations. I haven't thought about this deeply, but I think in any sort of like process procedure, like you want to set up ways of hearing and engaging with all different kinds of voices, right? And I mean, it's maybe not, you don't always know what the hot button issue or topic is going to be before you present it. Or when you try to state a conflicting opinion or view on something, how you don't always know which one's going to get the kind of backlash that you sometimes are surprised by. But I think if for some of these high stakes decisions or perspectives that an organization needs to stand behind, I think it's I sort of think about like the Supreme Court justices, right? There is a majority opinion and there's a minority opinion. So it doesn't always have to be that there's like a unified voice from an organization that comes out. It can be the majority opinion, but you can also have ways of elevating different voices in that process too, and being transparent about it. So I think for me, it's about setting up these in an institutional sense anyway, it's about trying to set up ways for like voices to be heard and recognized, and being transparent about how decisions are made and how those are achieved.
Yeah, I think this kind of links in with the AI conversation that we were having as well too. I think it's important to have good practice in being with disagreeing with people, respectfully disagreeing with people, having platforms to critique and respond and and all that, as long as it's in good faith, right? And I think that would be possibly where SCV could facilitate that, good faith discussions, debates, and so on. Now you're not gonna have control over how people will approach that, obviously, but I think that in terms of providing an avenue and a venue for people to engage in public discourse and in a respectful manner, um, is I think really important. And I think that again, practicing that and I saw that Bright's question in the chat there, seeing from an early career scholar perspective, seeing more advanced scholars engage in that and kind of, mirroring that or mimicking that and seeing that it's safe to do so is I think an important thing to kind of in terms of moving forward. I think right now a lot of people don't want to, discuss things. And I think that leads to more problems than anything else. And so similar with kind of seeing what AI is all about, seeing what different perspectives might be all about while kind of coming to the table and hopefully having respectful discourse.
But I just wanted to recognize Bright's question in the chat, which I think is a good one about, I mean, she asks, you know, a paper is never going to be perfect. There's always somebody who disagrees with something that's written in the paper. And so what advice do you have for scholars trying to speak critically while also navigating the risks with publishing? And I think, I mean, my view on that is like, it's always easy to put little spicy hot takes like in papers about, X, Y, or Z topic. And I think it's worth reflecting on, in any specific publication, like what is your core message and what are you willing to fight for, right? There's some, little pieces of things that that's not the point of the paper. It's not the hill that you want to die on. But if it's central to the argument of the paper and that's part of the point, then go for it and defend it, right? That's what scholarship's about. It's about elevating these debates and figuring out like how we go about doing things, right? So don't shy away from things, but make sure that the ones that you want that are going to be brought into focus are the ones that you want to have the discussion around, right?
I think that's a really good point, and hopefully this doesn't come off poorly. I didn't get into science and academia to make friends. Like I did it for the science and for knowledge and for all that stuff. And if you make friends, great. If you don't, that's okay too. Um, and I think that that's again that to Brian's point, you go with the core. Like what is the argument? What does the data suggest, or what does the experience suggest, or whatever it might be. Um, if somebody doesn't like it, that's fine. You know, you might have somebody who does like it, and it is what it is. But that's kind of the way I've always approached kind of my career is that I did this for knowledge. I did this for science. And so that's kind of the approach I take it as.
Yeah, I fully agree. And maybe a small last point about that is that as early career scholars, it's you're probably more insecure about the publication. But this only happened to me when I was like I think I'd been an academic for 10 years already when that happened. So you never know what's going to happen, like Brian also said before. And the most important, I think, is to stick to your facts. If your facts are correct, you won't, well, you may still get in trouble. Somebody may still disagree or dislike what you write. But also pick your battles. Like, is it the core of your argument, like Will said? And one thing I like to add to the SCB specific position, if obviously I don't know what your capacity is, we can give you all kinds of jobs to to do, but it will depend on practical issues as well, obviously. But yeah, maybe online have a forum or something with or a guideline outlined about this. I think that would be something very helpful in a sense if people are aware of that. The question is actually how to write that guideline, and that is quite difficult also because it might become a bit abstract because every case of intimidation is very different. So it's easier said than done, and it might also just in the end reflect an ethics document, an ethics guideline. So or at least partly, I think it will differ from that also. If it's really practical support, what to do when you're intimidated, it won't be like an ethics guideline, but yeah, there might still be some overlap. But yeah, so I don't know, but you could have like a mediating position in that regard, maybe, or a guiding position. But that obviously also depends on how many scholars you have or people you have available more generally. So I don't know that will be a very important question in the background.
Thank you. And great question, Bright. We've got one more that was pre-submitted, and this is in particular toward Will, but kind of like all the other questions, I can see this spanning more broadly. So we've got criminology often relies on structured evidence systems. How do you reconcile this with more situated qualitative knowledge in conservation settings? So I'd love to hear your response to that. And then a little more broadly, I think a lot of us work across disciplines, and so maybe we all have some, maybe y'all also have some thoughts on that. Will?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Similar with the other ones as well, two really good questions. Within criminology and criminal justice, there's been an increased and paid attention to the need to understand perspectives and approaches that go beyond, quote unquote, mainstream or traditional concepts and responses that we are typically accustomed to. More recently, well, not more recent, probably in the last like 3 decades, so recent. For example, increased attention on the potential value and benefit of indigenous and Aboriginal practices, such as restorative justice, has been highlighted as a potential alternative to traditional criminal justice responses. This has particularly been done in research that's originated in Canada and in Australia, and has kind of expanded beyond that. And recognizing that there's a lot of insight and knowledge in terms of how people respond to um, uh, activities and behavior that go against the community that they reside in or live within. Even if there may not be a formal criminal justice system, there are still formal and informal responses to behavior. And so associating such knowledge with theoretical or programmatic effectiveness and efficiency, I think would be beneficial to inform the development of policy in specific settings. I believe that the potential role of further situating and further contextualizing and understanding um, avenues of conservation-related crimes and deviant behavior, as well as the subsequent responses, whether it be formal or informal, is very much needed. And generalized responses that fail to account or recognize such kind of traditional forms of knowledge or insight, particularly within context, will prove to be problematic. I think it's absolutely important to recognize, especially if it's an external suggestion or implementation, failure to recognize the contextual or how it's received contextually will likely result in either one, inefficiency, unsustainability, or the worst case scenario is that it actually leads to counterproductive outcomes. So it actually results in increased problems or whatever it might be. And so I think that it's absolutely important to recognize that kind of information and knowledge and build within any type of response, whether it be formal or informal.
May I say something about that too? Yep. No, I fully agree, Will, and I think it would actually be interesting. I did quite a bit of work on rhino poaching in South Africa and next to the Kruger National Park. And I'm not a criminologist. What you presented, Will, was, well, much of it was new to me, not everything. But the structured evidence systems in relation to the qualitative knowledge, I think actually structured evidence systems also become part of the local situation in a particular way. And I think it's also good to integrate them in your research. Doing research is not necessarily, may also affect your data itself, depending on exactly what type of research you do. But take a bit of a stand back, so to speak, and look at it more from a distance. What is this doing now? The criminology data, so to speak, the more structured evidence. What does that mean? How is it being picked up in society? Locally, like you already explained, Will, and different types of response systems. How does it relate to that? But also, what does it do itself? Because I know in South Africa, a lot of crime statistics were also being used to create a particular discourse about poachers, particular discourse about private nature reserves, where there's a lot of militarization going on against poaching. And it actually reinforced the whole idea of fortification of conservation. You know, fortress conservation is back. And it's back seriously in South Africa because of militarization. And it partly has to do also with data about crime. And I think the data about crime, by the way, are not themselves the problem, but what happens with it is also important. So I think that's a bit of an elaboration on your earlier answer.
Yeah, absolutely, and great points. I think that's the reason why I think it's important to separate criminology and criminal justice,
Yeah.
mainly because of the fact that with criminal justice, one of the key concepts that people look into is discretion,
Yeah.
right? People, police officers have the discretion to arrest somebody or to cite them or to let them go. Prosecutors have the discretion to charge somebody or let them go. Judges have discretion. Yeah, there's all this discretion permeates throughout the criminal justice system, and that in itself impacts data. So the data that we take a look at is very much still human informed as well too. And so recognizing kind of the ins and outs of the system itself gives us a better understanding of the data that we're looking at, which then informs also our criminological theories as to why people commit offenses. And so it's a frustratingly fascinating problem to have, but really good points in the sense of realistically, depending on the state of affairs, the country, the location, the government, etc., you could manufacture a problem, right? Simply because in terms of how you kind of move your criminal justice system in a certain direction. So absolutely. Well, point well taken.
And we're getting close to 2 hours when I feel like many brains need a break. So maybe let's final call here for questions or other thoughts you had in response to previous questions, panelists, anything else that's coming to mind. Trying to respect the silence here for just a moment.
If there are no burning questions, I was just going to say that it's been a really fascinating conversation for me, and I think there is this really nice thread across all three talks about, you know, how we come to know that, you know, this sort of epistemological thread through like how we come to know things and use and build evidence to support things that we need to do in the world. And I think that's a really useful conversation.
Yeah, I echo Brian. Again, thanks so much for the questions from the audience as well too. I was kind of tired before this whole thing started. Now I'm all awake. Like, I'm all excited again. So again, thank you very much for the conversation.
Same here. Thanks a lot also to you, Bright and Kyle, for organizing all this and for leading it. And I actually had one question for Brian. It's a very quick one, and it's just I wrote it down when you were presenting. It's a very quick, practical question. I think it's a short answer. Does AI actually does AI scan? It relates to the epistemic justice question in a particular way. Does AI scan academic papers in a different language? For instance, Portuguese papers from Brazil, Chinese language papers. I realize English language dominates science more broadly, but there are still countries where other languages are very important too, including in academia. Does it
Yeah.
scan those as well?
Yeah, yes. As far as I know, I mean, like what actually goes into the training data for some of these models is not very transparent either. It's obvious that, you know, they're scanning some academic databases, but it's not very clear which ones always. But there have been tests and work to try to see how well AI does in different language contexts, and it actually performs pretty well even in languages that aren't very well documented. So as far as like a language bias issue, it seems to, well, do better than average, you know, for small minority languages. It still has a bias, like, you know, that, you know, English and dominant languages it certainly performs better with, but it still you know, has pretty strong capabilities even among things that it seemingly shouldn't. So there are a couple of publications I could share that are sort of based on that, and we cite them, I believe, in that paper. But you know, how well it dives into like sort of more local literature that might be locally based in a specific language context, you know, I think that is a little less clear. I don't, you know.
Well, fantastic questions, fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed hearing and learning from you guys today. So thank you all very much. As a reminder, I'll put in the chat. So this was organized by the Programs and Conferences Committee of the Social Science Working Group of the Society of Conservation Biology, all of those acronyms. So you can find out more about SSWG on their website, which I just put a link in the chat. And also a link to the special issue Trends and Future Directions, the Conservation and Social Sciences. We have another panel session we're in September, so in October, and then a third in November. So look for advertisements for that. And we'll also be able to include a link to today's recording. So you guys can share and disseminate as you feel is appropriate to folks who you think might be interested. And we'd be happy to have them asynchronously join today's session. And then please consider joining the upcoming October and November sessions. And thank you all again so much. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Have a good day.
Thanks all.
I couldn't leave.